How you doing?
Great, how are you?
Good.
So good to talk to you.
Yeah, you too. Yeah, it's nice to see you face to face instead of just through messages or something.
Yes, exactly. If it would be okay with you, could we just do like a quick little intro and maybe you introduce yourself and tell us kind of a little bit of your background and before we jump into some deep questions?
Yeah, so my name's Michael Jones. I run Inspiring Philosophy Ministries. It's a nonprofit organization. Do a lot of philosophical apologetic type videos. I have a master's in philosophy from the University of Arizona that I just finished up this spring. So it's a little bit about me.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So I think that you and I have talked a little bit about this before. I may have briefly mentioned it, but I actually came across your channel on YouTube a while back because I was going through a stage where I don't want to say debating, but I was wrestling with young earth and old earth creationism. I had a friend who I met on TikTok. He said, listen, no hate, but just look at this. Just look at this channel. And I was like, I'm stubborn. And fine, okay, fine. And so I started the first episode and I was like, what? It really hit me because I was talking to my husband about this actually while we were at dinner. I said, it really excited me because I'm somebody who really values intellectual conversation, particularly around these topics, because I like context and I care about culture and I care about literary style. And so that I was like, finally, this makes sense. So if you guys aren't familiar with the series that we're talking about, Michael did a series. Was it just called Genesis
It's called Genesis 1 to 11.
1
So
to
it's just
11?
my commentary on Genesis 1 to 11 in the form of video. So if you pick up a commentary on Genesis,
Yep.
you'll have people go through verse, chapter, or something like that. I do the same thing just in video form.
Right. Anyway, I'm happy that we're finally able to connect and talk about something that I'm really passionate about, which is interesting because it connects back to the Genesis 1 to 11 series. And
Hmm.
I am so grateful for that because it's helped in my journey with my daughter. We found out that going to she was going to have special needs. We knew that
Hmm.
back in February. And so we just didn't know what life was going to look like. And it was a really challenging pregnancy. And then she was in the NICU
Hmm.
for a month where we got all of her final diagnoses, so she has lissencephaly, which is a rare brain disorder, amongst a myriad of other things. But I have really enjoyed sharing about her story. But one thing that
Hmm.
I've gotten a lot of from the Christian community is really bizarre comments that were just like I've wrestled with a lot, including things like, God didn't do this to her. God didn't do this. This wasn't God. Like, God, yes, He made her, but He didn't make this. He didn't. And that
Hmm.
just really irks me. Like, it really bugs me. I think people, and you can tell me your thoughts on this, I think people mean well.
Hmm.
I think it just comes maybe from poor theology. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that as well. I recently had a debate in Houston with a young Earth creationist, Marcus Ross, and someone brought up a question in the Q&A is like, why would God curse all of creation because of Adam's sin? Like, why do the animals have to now suffer and die? Why do people have to, suffer from diseases? And he didn't really have a good answer to it. And it brings up an issue here, is that does the Bible say that literally all suffering results from Adam's sin? And I don't think it does at all. I think in Genesis 1, we have a clear indication that there already was suffering happening outside of the garden and throughout the world. And that was the whole point of God coming down to create Eden, was to sort of be, this is now the restoration process. This is now the next step for creation. It's been going on for long enough, and now we're going to come in and make it something even better. And of course, humans were the main point in that, but we fell in Adam, and then Christ came to restore us and set us back on our true purpose.
I think what would be really cool is to kind of get your feedback, and then if I have anything that I feel like is relevant to our story or anything like that, I'll kind of chime in too. But I feel like you articulate this really well. So the
Well, thank you.
first question is, was the Garden of Eden truly a place of perfection without sickness and death prior to the fall? Is it possible that had Adam and Eve not sinned, sickness, death, disease still would have been experienced?
I think so. I think the thing we need to think about Eden, though, is we need to go back before Eden in Genesis 1.
Mm-hmm.
As I mentioned a little bit earlier, is that God tells mankind to subdue the earth.
Yes.
Now, that word subdue is very harsh in Hebrew. It typically is used of things like a war conquest, enslavement, trampling underfoot. It's this idea that when God is telling someone to subdue, you're going to experience conflict. Now, that's going to create suffering. That's going to create hardship. Eden is sort of set up as sort of like a base camp. You kind of say it's like a temple as well, mostly, but
Mm-hmm.
sort of like where God is going to dwell, and He's going to start bringing the perfection of God to the whole world. But that He's going to work through humans is sort of the idea. But that's going to create suffering and conflict with the chaos that's outside of Eden.
Right.
I think we have this idea that death is already there. Adam and Eve are elected to be priests. They have access to the tree of life, which makes them special, makes them immortal.
Mm-hmm.
They sin and they lose access to that. So it was this idea that there was an opportunity for humanity to enter into a more closeness with God that would also have had immortality. We rejected that. We fell. And with that, we were sort of put back in the chaotic wilderness that we were supposed to tame, to see the consequences of our actions, of trying to set up ourselves as little gods. So that's the kind of concept we get in Eden. And we also get the implication in Genesis 2 and 3 that Adam is already mortal.
Mm-hmm.
In the Bible, there's a constant theme of dust. Someone is dust, it means they're mortal. We see this in Ecclesiastes 3. And then in Genesis 3, God says to Adam, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Why is he calling him dust? If he was already human, he was not dust anymore. If you take the literal reading, he was made from dust. He would not be dust now. Well, God is saying he's mortal. You are dust, and the dust you will return. Now, notice God doesn't say, I'm making you dust again. He just is dust.
Right.
And then what does God do? He cuts them off from the tree of life. He doesn't change their bodies. He doesn't curse them. He curses the ground and says, well, all right, well, now you can't have access to the tree of life because you now have partaken of this sinful act. So I think we need to think of Eden not so much as, or I think we need to think of Genesis 1 and 2 not so much as this idea that when God created the heavens and the earth, he made everything absolutely perfect. There was
Mm-hmm.
no death in the entire universe. There was no suffering in the entire universe. Michael Heiser once asked a simple question.
Mm-hmm.
If in Eden an elephant fell on Adam, would that have hurt?
Right.
Would he have died? What if he fell out of a tree and broke his neck?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, he wasn't a superhuman.
Right.
There's no indication of that. He would have experienced suffering. So this idea that I think Eden, even on the young earth creation account, that it would have been totally lacking of suffering, I don't think is in the Bible. And I think that'd be compatible with a good and loving God, actually, this idea of a total lack of suffering.
When I was listening, I think a lot of people genuinely do believe that in the garden, Adam and Eve were without all sickness, were without all pain, and that they were totally immortal in the garden. But my
Mm-hmm.
understanding, based on what we know about the tree of life, is that that may have been the eventual ideal, perhaps, but that eternal fellowship with God as possibly immortal, perfect beings, maybe, but that with the sin came that destruction and the fall. And
Mm-hmm.
what's interesting to me is the way that the Bible as a whole kind of comes full circle, and that we still have, by the grace of God, the opportunity to receive that eternal fellowship with Him. And that's so
Mm-hmm.
powerful to me, because I'm like, it almost makes me appreciate the story of Eden more than not being these eternal perfect beings.
Yeah. And I think we need to think about the whole metaphysical status of suffering just in and of itself. Do you think it'd be better for God to create a world without suffering or a world with suffering from which good can come out of? So let me ask you a simple question. What's your favorite movie or book? Or what's a really good movie or book that you can think of if you can't think of your favorite?
People will probably judge me so heavy, but Braveheart is my all time favorite movie ever.
All right. Yes, I am judging you, so there is that. But so why didn't you pick the Care Bears or the Teletubbies?
There's no rise and I mean it's all stagnant.
It's stagnant. You just have happy people, happy creatures living in a happy world where nothing happens. But you picked a story where someone goes through real suffering, triumphs over it, and then enters into eternity in a happy state, which tells us something implicit. And I think all humans accept this by the stories we pick, tell, that say they're our favorites. We know that a better world is a world with suffering, where the good guys triumph over evil and become better and triumph out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, my favorite book, movies, is Lord of the Rings.
Fair.
I think what would be better? Sorry, Frodo stays in the Shire and has breakfast all the time, or Frodo goes to Mount Doom,
Mm-hmm.
goes through this incredible journey, comes back, and he's more enlightened hobbit, and he has saved the Shire. He's basically died for the Shire in a sense because he goes off to the Undying Lands and all. We see that as a much better story because we see characters who actually have to go through suffering and triumph over it. And I think God understands this basic concept, and we do too, by the implicitly by the stories we pick to be the best stories, the worlds that we really fall in love with, the characters of these worlds we really fall in love with. It's this idea that God understands that there has to be some suffering, there has to be something to be triumphed over, because a maximally good world is a world with suffering that is triumphed over and defeated. It's much better than a world that entirely lacks suffering and no one ever experiences pain or misery. I mean, could you imagine a world without suffering or pain? Like, let's say, you fall, you're climbing a tree, you fall out, you don't feel any pain. Did you learn anything? Did you change anything? I mean, there's no real consequences for you as a human. You never actually get to grow and learn and experience. A world without suffering means you can never truly experience courage. But
Mm-hmm.
we look at courage as a good virtue that people should have. But you can't have courage unless there's danger or fear. Compassion, real compassion for someone, can only be experienced if someone is experiencing sorrow. So we understand that there is this idea that suffering may be inherently bad, but it has instrumental goodness, and its instrumental goodness makes a world far better in the long run. And so I think that's the same thing God, in his wisdom, knows. So this idea that he created a world initially back before the fall, where there was zero suffering, zero pain, just seems incompatible with a wise and loving God who understands, for us to truly become his children, for us to truly ascend, be sanctified, one day be able to judge angels, as the Bible tells us, in heaven. We need to go through something that's going to make us into these wise, free creatures that truly represent him.
No, I totally agree. It's interesting because I've wrestled a lot with, I wouldn't change anything about Marsaili.
Mm-hmm.
It is so hard. It is so hard, especially on days like today. So we had a really hard day with her seizures today. And we are completely helpless. We are completely helpless when it comes to her seizures because she typically clusters, which means that she will have, as many as 10, 15 in an hour. I mean, just seizure after seizure after seizure after seizure. And if the medicine that we give her as a rescue med doesn't work, we're down at the ER. And it's literally just like us on our knees, like praying and hoping that we don't have to do that day. But with all of that being said, like she's taught us so much about courage and adversity and pressing through, and like goodness, the child is so strong. I mean, she's
Mm-hmm.
fighting, and that's what's interesting is like watching her therapists were over this past week, and she was like, Hillary, she keeps fighting, and I'm like, yeah, it's really cool because she wants to interact, and she does it differently, but she wants to interact, and that's inspiring, and it's inspiring to me, and it's inspiring to Josh, it's inspiring to the people that hear her story.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's hard because like you hate to see your child go through that, but also I wouldn't change a thing about her.
Yeah, and that's very interesting because I've heard other people who've gone through suffering like this say the same thing. So, like, can I ask why? Like, going more into that, because people often, I often hear a lot of people who don't experience real suffering like this say, well, suffering isn't compatible with a loving God. And here you are saying, no, you think the opposite. Expand on that.
So it also, I think, I have a bit of a unique background in that I was a physical therapist and I worked with children with special needs. So there's also that aspect of it where I experienced a lot of this as a therapist, watching these parents go through very similar things. And then now I'm a parent myself going through this. But being on the therapist side and now being on the parent side, you said it earlier, the level of compassion that you develop for people is astronomical. I mean, like, each stage of me going through graduate school and then becoming a PT and now being a mom of a child with special needs, like, the I don't want to like pat myself on the back here because that's not what this is about, but it's just like there's an ability to relate to people that wasn't there before. And
Mm-hmm.
there's an ability to have that compassion that wasn't there before. And with that comes an ability to show the world a little bit more of Jesus because of the way that he loved on all people. And so I think it's such a blessing because I'm able to, I don't know, like I just keep coming back to the compassion word. I don't think that I would have this level of empathy for other people and the ability to be like Christ in that way if I wasn't going through this.
What's interesting is I remember a philosopher, Trent Doherty, saying that when he interviewed people who've gone through suffering, they said like they wouldn't change anything of their past. They would not have tried to remove the suffering because it made them who they are. When I was born, for the first like 4 years of my life, my mother suffered from serious postpartum depression. And it
Mm-hmm.
took her a while to go through it and get help. But I went through I know in my earliest days, I was physically and verbally abused because of her going through all that suffering as well. So I went through a lot of suffering, but I don't know if I would go back and change that if I could wave a magic wand and get rid of it, because it made me who I am. It helped
Mm-hmm.
contribute to making me who I am. And it seems that you're saying the same thing, is that suffering makes us into better creatures in ways we did not expect it could from
Mm-hmm.
before, like from before we go through the suffering. Like from looking ahead and we see suffering coming, like, I don't want to go through that. It's horrible. But when we get to the other side, it seems that a lot of the time we say, I'm really glad I went through that. And I always find that fascinating, why we do that. And it seems like Christ knows that that is going to turn us into something far better. But we also know that in the end, good is always going to triumph over, and then there's going to be this like we've gone through the trials, and at the end there is a blissful state where this has all been defeated.
So it's interesting because I kind of want to draw a parallel here to childbirth. So the stages of childbirth, there's a stage called transition. And in natural childbirth, when I say natural, meaning without an epidural, the
Mm-hmm.
transition phase is typically deemed the hardest phase of labor. It's the phase of labor where women go, I cannot do this. This is awful. I don't want to do this again. I never want to do this again. Give me the meds. Like, they are so miserable. But it's literally, ironically, that transition stage is the last stage before they really transition into like pushing and baby being born. And so I've
Mm-hmm.
heard moms describe it this way before, where they say it's such a bear of a stage of labor right before the miracle happens. And then when they look back on childbirth, as hard as that was, they would not change anything about it. They love and appreciate every single phase of that labor, as hard as it was. And even for moms like me who have gone through two different types of labor. So I had an epidural with my son, and then I had a C-section delivery with Marsaili. But before I had the C-section, I was in the hospital for 10 days because the condition that I had was life-threatening for me. And so
Mm-hmm.
that was hard, and that was my own transition phase. But again, like, all of those things happened right before this magnificent thing of giving birth to my children. I would never change
Mhm.
anything about either of those, as sucky as it was in the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, and this is it's always fascinating that the way that people that go through a lot of this suffering, it seems that it happens in a lot is that suffering either defeats a person,
Mhm.
they become bitter and angry and vindictive, and they're just mad at the world, mad at nature, mad at God, or people come through suffering and they feel like that it has made them into a better person, and they allow it to grow them into better human beings. So I always just find this fascinating that, but the idea that if asked to wave a magic wand, will we get rid of the suffering in our past? And most of the people that have grown from it, that have seen how it has made them into better people, immediately say no, they wouldn't change anything. So why would we think God would not know this, would know better
Right.
in that sense? He would understand that the suffering is useful, it's good, it can do good things, it's going to make us into better characters, the type of characters that can inherit Eden,
Right.
inherit heaven, and judge properly, and rule over the universe as we're expected to in His name in the coming resurrection.
Right.
So I think it's just very much the same idea we get with the stories we pick. Why do we pick the stories where a character goes through hard suffering only to triumph over it and become a better person? I think we understand suffering is essential
Hmm.
if you have free creatures. It's essential for us to grow and to become the true sons of God we're called to be. Sons and daughters of God, of course.
I
Now,
agree.
I do want to say, though, the reason why I do say sons of God is actually an interesting concept in the Bible, because Paul says in one of his letters, you are all sons of God. And he's pointing out that in that ancient world, the sons only got inheritance, but he's saying to the entire church, men and women, you are all considered sons of God. You all will get the inheritance.
Yep. So, one of the more frequent things that I receive by people who were attempting to be comforting was they would say, no, God didn't do this. We have sickness in this world as a result of sin. And I don't think they recognize how much of a struggle that is. And this, we might even have already answered this, but my question was, is it possible that people with special needs, like Marsaili, or people who are uniquely abled, who aren't typically developing, that maybe they aren't the result of sin and have always had a place in God's purpose and function?
Well, I think that's scriptural.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you look at Exodus 4, who made the
Right.
deaf, the mute, the blind. You also, remember you bring up John 3 at one point, Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but the works of God might be displayed in him.
Yes.
And and again, like sometimes maybe God allows for this because He wants to use a greater purpose in someone, to use the suffering or the something that we may not see as perfect, so that God can do great works through it. Again, go back to storytelling. In George R. R. Martin's world, Song of Ice and Fire, one of the main characters is a dwarf, Tyrion Lannister. But
Mm-hmm.
he's a lot of people's favorite character in the books because he's just so witty, and he's treated lowly, like he's treated like a lesser human being because of his disability. And but you ask yourself, like, would this story have been written better if he wasn't a dwarf? And the answer is no. That made him such a deep and interesting character in the books that you just want to know more about him. And I think God says in places like Exodus 4, John 9:3, that God uses these things to do great things in this earth, to tell better stories, to create better characters, and we are the characters. And I think these are great examples of this.
For sure. The verse that, so in addition to Exodus 4 and John 9, the verse that I always come back to is Psalm 139. And I ask people, I say, okay, like, so if that's what you're saying, then this verse can't be true. Because in this verse, in 139, 13 through 16, it says, you knitted me together. So did he knit together just the parts that are comfortable to you, or did he knit it all? And what I've
Mm-hmm.
discovered is for the, and I was talking to my husband about this earlier, I think it's, a lot of people get very uncomfortable when we talk about this because they can't wrap their brain around the possibility that a good God would knit together things that could be difficult for somebody to endure. And I don't know why. I mean, I do know why, but I guess like being in it now, I'm like, no, he knits us all together. That is a very blatant truth. Like he didn't, it doesn't say he knit me together except for this. Because none of
Well,
it,
let's also
you know?
Oh yeah, I agree. But let's take this to another level. I mean, are we all made deficient because we don't have wings?
Right.
Or are we all made deficient because we're not immortal, because we die, because we can suffer from depression, because we can suffer from exhaustion and hunger and thirst? I mean, these are all things that are natural, but we don't look at those as if we're deficient in some way, that we are somehow less. So if God makes somebody blind without sight, is that necessarily a deficiency? And I think metaphysically that is a leap in logic. If we were all born blind and someone was born with sight, he would be the weirdo, or he'd be like a
Mm-hmm.
superhuman. But I think we need to be very careful with equating someone who may be born with like a physical disability or a mental disability as being a metaphysical deficiency. We need to think about what God is trying to do. Is he trying to create us all to be superhumans that never experience suffering and are always experiencing joy? No, he's trying to build souls that will freely choose him, chase after his own image, that will grow and develop and be the proper sons and daughters of God he wants us to be. The same thing people do when they tell their own stories, like Lord of the Rings or Braveheart or A Song of Ice and Fire. You don't create superhumans that can just get rid of every problem. You create humans that have deficiencies but are able to overcome them and become something better. So why wouldn't God have the same understanding when he creates us?
Right. It's, I think, and this is a little bit of a rabbit trail too, but I've appreciated this conversation. I'm glad that you brought up depression because in this past pregnancy, especially once we got Marsaili's diagnosis, I had to be treated for anxiety and depression. Obviously, like I was going through a really difficult time. Like, and so, but there's such a toxic view in areas of the church where they want to attribute mental illness to demons. And it's so unfortunate to me because I go, no, it's such a toxic theology. And as
Yes.
difficult as my depression has been and my anxiety has been, like, I am so grateful for modern medicine. I'm so grateful for that as a blessing and therapists and things like that. But I don't think that again, I think God has always had a purpose and a function for people like me who struggle with that. I don't think that my purpose and my function is different just because I struggle with the mental illness.
Well, let's talk about depression in the Bible because there's a great story about depression. It's in the story of Elijah.
Yes.
Elijah beats the prophets of Baal on the mount. He wins, and then he goes off to the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel. But then he gets there and he finds out Jezebel has troops that are going to go out and kill him. Okay, so he just proved that Yahweh is the real God, and there was no revolution. No one came to his defense. They didn't overthrow the king, demand proper worship of God restored. So what does he do? He runs off into the wilderness and he tells God he wants to die. He's depressed. The first thing God does is he doesn't cast the demons out.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't say, Elijah, you've just not been praying enough. You're really going to be filled with the Spirit. Get back there. The first thing God does for Elijah, he cooks. He makes him a meal. He tells
Mm.
him to take a nap. He's like, you need to sleep. You need to eat. You're physically worn out.
My husband
So
tells me that
God,
every now and then.
exactly. Yeah, I tell my wife she needs the nap too. It's this idea that God understands depression can have a physical basis. And sometimes we don't need more prayer. Sometimes we don't need a spiritual pep talk. Sometimes we just need a nap and a decent meal, or you need a vacation. People need to relax. So depression is not from demons necessarily. It could be, but I would say that it's rare. Sometimes depression is just physical, and God understands that in the Bible. Notice how he nurtures Elijah in his physical and his emotional needs. He doesn't just tell him, you got to make sure you're praying harder. That's why you're depressed, because that's silly. And that's an unfortunate thing we see a lot of modern Christians do today. But sometimes depression, a lot of times it has a very physical basis. People need antidepressants. They need to relax. They need to be less stressful. They need to focus on these things. And this comes directly from the Bible.
Yes. And it's so kind of what we're going back to what we were talking about earlier. My friend brought this up, and it's so funny because I was literally thinking this as she typed it. She was mentioned ADHD. Kind of what we're going back to what we were talking about earlier. The way that your brain works is uniquely created by God, and who's to say that that hasn't allowed you to think differently for a great purpose? And I don't think that enough people hear that. I don't think enough people hear about the ways in which their unique brain is a benefit to them, and they only hear about their deficiencies. That's unfortunate. Because yes, the disability is real and should not be ignored. I don't want anybody to overlook the fact that Marsaili has disabilities, but I also don't want
Hmm.
them to overlook the fact that she has abilities as well,
Yeah.
and that she is fully capable of achieving whatever God has in line for her to achieve on her own time.
Yeah, and it goes back to the example of Tyrion Lannister in A Song of Ice and Fire. The fact that he was a dwarf gave him abilities that no one else in that world had,
Right.
because it gave him a different perspective, it gave him different thoughts, and he was able to use that to become one of the smartest people in the entire series. And so when people have these disabilities, it gives them something that other people do not have. It gives them different perspectives. It gives them a different and unique story would be the better word to say it,
Right.
than someone like you or me. But you and I have our own deficiencies and areas that give us our own unique stories.
Right.
And I think God understands that. Notice how he nurtures people differently when he was Christ, or still
Mm-hmm.
is Christ. But when Lazarus dies, Mary gets tears, but Martha gets a sermon.
Mm-hmm.
His disciples get a lecture, basically. He understands different people give different things based on where they are, where their strengths and weaknesses are. And I think we have to recognize that's what God is trying to do. And of course, this is also tied into the fact that in the end, we're going to become something far better. But I mean, like, you also got to think of it like, would it be better if like some of our things we see as like deficiencies now are gone in eternity? Like I'm 5'8", so I consider myself short for men. This is not as a serious suffering example, but like
Sure.
uh, I got picked on and beat up a lot in high school, so I started taking martial arts classes.
Okay.
Now I'm a second degree black belt. I got to the point where I could win a fight easily, not by using strength and overpowering someone because I was taller, but because I realized I was fast and agile.
Right.
So this is a not nearly like the suffering example that other people have, but you get the idea that because of my height and my size, it allowed me to find new abilities and experiences. And now I wouldn't change that about me. I wouldn't if I could wave a magic wand and make myself taller. I don't think I'd be who I was. I think I would turn myself into a mockery of who I am. And I think I like the way I am now. I think it's better that way.
Yeah.
This is the same thing Paul says. I prayed 3 times that God would remove the thorn on my side, but
Yeah.
in your weakness, my strength is revealed. So this idea that maybe we see things as weaknesses or deficiencies or disabilities really aren't, and maybe that's part of sanctification, is that we come to realize
Mm.
this is who we are meant to be, and it's a good thing. I like this about me. It makes me who I am. It makes a unique character, a unique person that could never have come about without it.
I've told people so many times, it was so hard for me to leave physical therapy. Like I did long-term care for these kids. So when I left, I had kids for 2, 3 years, that I've been working with. There was one kid that I literally taught him how to walk. And then when I left, he was like running and jumping and playing. And the the honor that it is to be able to work with kids who have so many unique abilities that the world just does not appreciate. Like, oh my gosh, there's a connection that you develop with them that you cannot develop with anybody else. And the way that they think is just a blessing. I don't know how to describe it as anything other than
Mm.
that.
Well, yeah, I just want to quickly say I find that so fascinating because again, I talk to atheists in academia, these atheist philosophers, they say this is a bad thing. This is evidence against God's existence. And then people that are actually working with them say, no,
Oh.
this is what I would expect to be if there was a God, because of having a world with kids like this. It makes it in such a more loving world. And so it's really fascinating to hear that.
I That boggles my mind, because and I think honestly the only way, maybe I'm biased. I think the only way you come to that conclusion is if you haven't interacted with these kids, because they show more compassion than a lot of Christians that I know. And that's huge. I mean, I could tell so many stories. But I mean, even
Mm.
with my own son too. So my son is 4, and he doesn't know what it's like to have a normal sibling relationship, right? Marceli's his only sibling. And so he will grow up with somebody totally different from him and have more knowledge and experience than a lot of people will have, because that was his life. And
Hmm.
as much as I would love for him to be able to I grieve that sometimes. Like there is grief that comes with that, where you want desperately for your child to be able to have that best friend sibling. But then I think about it and I'm like, she can still be his best friend. She can totally still be his best friend. They just have a different relationship, and there's nothing wrong with that.
Yeah, that's very interesting. It definitely gives. I think it gives people a much better perspective on suffering and the way the world is, in a way that a lot of people just don't think about.
For sure. Why do you think the default for Christians when people ask like, oh, why is there sickness? Why is there suffering? Why do you think that the default is because we live in a fallen world? Why do you think that they think it's so heretical for Eden to have been imperfect?
Yeah, it makes sense. I think it's just a snap. I think it's just like a snap reaction. They don't want to think too much about it.
Mm.
It's much easier just to think pain bad, happy good, and don't have to worry about it. And I think that's just about a lot of the way we think. It's just humans. We just take the simple way out, and not have to try to worry about it. And there's also a lot in the church that has been for the past since the 1960s, I'd say, about this idea that Eden was perfect. There was no sin or pain before the
Mm.
fall in the entire cosmos, and that just prior to the 60s, that just wasn't a major Christian view. It really
Interesting.
happened. Yeah, it really happened when these two guys named Henry Morris and John Wickham Jr. wrote a book called The Genesis Flood, and they recycled a lot of old Seventh-day Adventist arguments for a young Earth, and then they made it mainstream in Christianity. Prior to that, the overwhelming majority of Christians were old Earth creationists. It wasn't this idea. The anti-evolution movement in the 1920s was mostly old Earth creationists. It wasn't young Earth creationists. So
Oh,
this is a very recent phenomenon that came from Seventh-day Adventism initially, and then snuck into the church. I have a video on YouTube called the Origins of Young Earth Creationism, and I go through and I detail this history of
okay.
how this came out. It's really kind of funny actually because I cover a lot of this guy named this Seventh-day Adventist apologist who really tried to advocate for this. His name is George McReady Price, and he sort of put it there. So that's where a lot of this comes from.
Mm.
And I think for a lot of people, it's just a knee-jerk reaction. Well, suffering is bad, and that's of the work of the side of evil, and God is always going to do something good. What is goodness? Well, it's making people happy. People just sort of default to that sometimes, unfortunately, and I think that's just not in the Bible. What is God trying to do? Well, he's trying to make virtuous creatures. He's trying to make sanctified creatures. Suffering is going to be essential as an instrumental goodness to make sanctified and virtuous creatures. It's not just about making us happy. It's about making us creatures worthy to judge angels, worthy to stand in the
Mm.
resurrection and be his true representatives. That's going to require a lot of work, especially in our current state now. It's a lot of work, I would say. So we need to keep that in mind. People just don't think like that. They think the moment they die, they'll be in heaven and they'll just be in a 5-star resort for eternity. I don't think that at all about us. I think when we, I think this is like the train. I think this is the initial tutorial for existence, and then after we're going to have so much more to do and work towards. My actual view of eschatology is that in the
Mm.
resurrection to come, we'll come back to this Earth, and it'll be our job to turn Earth into Eden, then the Moon, and then Mars, and then Venus, and then the rest of the galaxy. That's
My
going to take a lot of work.
husband would die hearing you talk about this because he has a fascination with, he talks about it, he's like the cosmos, Hillary, the cosmos.
Yeah, I think God elected us to bring Eden to the whole universe. So I think we
Mm.
need to be trained properly, and suffering is part of that. We're going to become the creatures worthy to do that. We're not just meant to die and go live in a 5-star resort in the sky for eternity. There's more to us, and that's why what's going on here. And I think God knows that. And this is what I think the beauty of the Bible is. There's more to us, and there's more work we need to do. This is just part one. This is just like the first chapter of like a very long book of us overcoming and defeating evil or defeating suffering or defeating chaos, bringing order to the cosmos. More is going to happen. So I say the moment I die, I think I'll be with Christ, but there's still going to be more work to do from that side. I just don't know what it is yet.
What do you make of the idea? Because eschatology is totally not something that I am very well versed in. What do you make of the idea that we will all get new bodies in the sense of perfection. Now that I've gone through everything that we've gone through, I'm like, I don't know. Like I don't know what it's going to be like.
I mean, be honest, neither do I. We just don't know, but we need to think about it in a little, just a smaller perspective. Are we all going to be our ideal height? Are we all going to be our ideal weight? Are we all going to be, like, man, I really don't like my eyes, or like, I have these people are always like, why are you so tired, IP? I just have bags under my head, just the way I look. It's just like, so that just happens. So like, am I going to be able to get rid of those? Am I going to have the perfect hair I've always wanted to? Am I going to have perfect muscles? I don't think so. I don't think we're going to have the ideal bodies we all have of ourselves in our brains. I
Right.
think there's more to that. I don't, so maybe there'll be this. I think there's this idea that the blind will see, the deaf will hear, this kind of concept. But I don't think we're going to be able to turn ourselves into the superhumans, the superheroes we think that we should be.
Right.
So we need to keep that in mind. I think there is beauty in the variety of us, in what we
Mm,
consider deficiencies at times,
yes.
and we need to accept that maybe those are essential parts of what makes us who we are, and that's okay.
I love that. I love that. How do you think we talked about Exodus 4 and Psalm 139 and John 9:3? Whenever I bring these up, I often don't really even get pushback from people who, think about this differently. It almost just stops the conversation. And I
Mm-hmm.
hate that because I really would like to dig deeper and have that, you know, I want to have that back and forth, but it almost just stops the conversation. So I never really get to understand how they interpret those verses. So for people who are like, no, there was no suffering before the fall, and that's what brought all of this stuff in, how do you feel like they interpret those verses?
That's a good question. I think they try to interpret them as God allows, like God sort of like creates a world, and He wanted everyone to not be blind or ever experience suffering. But because of the fallen world, He's got to sort of work within the limitations and say, well, the fall allows for corruption and deficiency, so someone's going to be born blind or someone's going to be born deaf. And that's technically from God because He made the world, but it has to be filtered through this fallen lens. I don't think that's necessarily true. I don't think that I don't think the fall made people blind. I don't think it brought deafness. I don't think it
Hmm.
brought muteness. I think those were there long before, just as part of our genetics, and it just is something that happens at times. But through that, God can still triumph over, bring about unique creatures wherever we are, bring about unique stories, and more to that. So I think people just want, again, I think they resort to this idea that pain is always bad, happiness is always good. Don't think beyond that, unfortunately.
Mm. How do you think we could all take this and have what can we learn about like God's faithfulness and how can we have better conversations with people who maybe disagree on this topic, have loving conversations, and what can we learn about his faithfulness through all of this, sickness, with disease, suffering.
Well, I think when it comes to that, I think we can understand that how God uses different people for different tasks in beautiful ways that we would not expect, that we would not see as God bringing something good out of this. Yet He shows that this is what He does all the time. He is able to write beautiful stories in people that we would see as having deficiencies, and He shows us, no, these are not deficiencies; these are their strengths, and I'm going to show the world these are their strengths. You did not expect this, but this is the way I work. It's the same thing again. Same thing when we write stories. We come up with characters that have like character flaws, and then those character flaws become their greatest strength in the long story and get them through difficult times. We find beauty in that, and then when we write those stories, we don't think those characters are having deficiencies. We see those characters as saying, "This, I'm making them this way so that something credible can be told in the story about them." So God can do the same thing with us on a much more real metaphysical level. Because I don't think we're just characters in a story. I think we're really conscious beings. We get the idea. It's just an analogy. So I think that, and I think that in itself is going to, if we can exemplify that and explain that, that's going to help us have better conversations with people that will disagree. We need to talk about how God can use suffering for instrumental goodness. How God can use how is something really a deficiency? Is like height
Mm-hmm.
differences deficiency? Are the fact that was Moses' speech impediment a deficiency? No. Look at what God was able to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to make sure we look at those kinds of things and say, are we really defining deficiencies properly? Are we defining disabilities properly? Are we understanding what God is trying to do in this world? Is he just trying to make everybody happy, like a magical butler in the sky? Or is he truly trying to make us worthy sons and daughters of God?
Well, and it's interesting that you bring that up because uh, I do try to be really careful in regards to saying that, Marsaili does have disabilities. I tell people that I say she has disabilities. She is uniquely abled, but she does have disabilities because
Mm-hmm.
people in people in the community that have disabilities, they are very particular about that. They're like, I want you to know because you need to take me seriously. Because a lot of times when we don't use that particular language, people don't think the disability is real, particularly if they can't physically see it, if it's not physically
Mm-hmm.
manifesting in a way that they expect. And I think that we're so particular about that because of the level of ableism in our community and the way in which our society is so centered around a particular type of functioning. So we have to be that way. We have to say, no, I have disabilities. Even though we know that they can be strengths, we almost have to
Right.
be that way because of the level of ableism in our society.
Right. We can recognize them as disabilities, but understanding in a metaphysical sense, these could be
Yes.
strength in certain ways for
Yes.
character development. Yeah, I agree with you. Yeah.
For sure. But I kind of want to open up both my comment section and your comment section if anybody has questions they want to ask.
Sure. Yeah. And if people want more, they can go to my YouTube channel, inspiringphilosophy.org,
Yes.
and you can see, you go to my playlist section, my Genesis 1 to 11 playlist is there. I also have a video called The Problem of Suffering, a Christian Response,
Mm-hmm.
where I go into a lot of this as well. And I talk about something I'm developing called the Law of Triumph,
Okay.
which is generally the idea that God has imbued in the universe something like a law, like anytime a creature encounters suffering, if they choose to, they can turn it into that suffering can be completely defeated and turn into an instrumental good that will be triumphed over. And so I talked about that there, and that idea. So if people want more, they can check out those videos.
Perfect.
But yeah, if that's good, we can just close out. I'm fine with
Yeah,
that.
I'm good. I really, really appreciate you, Michael. Thank you so much. And again, please check out Inspiring Philosophy on YouTube. So you are on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube now, right? Any other pages that you've got?
I have a Facebook page. I have a Twitter page.
Okay.
I think that's complete. I also have my website.
Perfect. And if anybody wants to check out the specific series, Michael mentioned it a few minutes ago, the specific series that we've been talking about today, it's the Genesis 1 through 11 playlist that's on his YouTube. It's absolutely fabulous. Highly recommend. But thank you so much. It's been an absolute treasure to talk to you. And I really appreciate these conversations. Josh was like, I'm so excited for you. I feel like this is going to really fill up your cup. So I just appreciate it so much.
Yeah. I'm glad to do it. So yeah, I'm always happy to do types of conversations.
Awesome. Well, I hope you have a great evening and we'll talk soon.
All right, I'll talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.